Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, August 13th, 2025, episode 463, and we're going to talk about AOL shutting down, supply and demand, and gouging and hoarding issues. If you are kind of a little older than a teenager, then you'll know that in the 1990s and late 1990s and early 2000s, the way that you had to access the internet was through a phone modem. Now, if you don't understand this terminology, you don't really need to worry about it, but they didn't have cable, Comcast, you know, uh, cable internet. They didn't have Fios. They didn't have any of these things, uh, even DSL. But rather, what you had to do was you had to take your phone, put it into this sort of suction cup kind of looking thing, so that the receiver, that which listens, and the micro, so yeah, that which sends signals and then receives the sound. They are hooked up, and then once you connect, you'll hear a series of beeps and uh, you know beeps, and then you connect to a server. And the speeds were not all that great. I remember using Napster, and I would queue up 4 or 5 songs, before I'd go to sleep. And by the time I woke up, they were, the 4 or 5 songs were downloaded. And I remember that people, once they started getting cable, they could do 4 or 5 songs in a minute. And it was pretty crazy. And so once you were able to use something like DSL or, you know, cable internet access, and then later on with Fios, then you abandon AOL. And that was pretty common that people stopped using AOL. I think the peak of AOL use was, let's see, I think I wrote it down. The height was in the year 2000. So 25 years ago, everyone was using AOL, the AOL Messenger, etc. Well, so it went into decline after that because people came up with faster ways of accessing the internet. The problem too back then, there were no cell phones. Cell phone use was not really all that common. It was very expensive. So everyone still had hard lines. And if you are accessing the internet with your hard line, you can't use the phone. And you didn't have multiple lines. And so if one person was online using the internet, you couldn't get in phone calls, you couldn't make any calls, so it was very inconvenient. And then once there were cell phones, and then faster ways of accessing the internet, of course, AOL is going to be in decline. So most of this information I'm getting from an article. AOL is finally shutting down its dial-up internet service. This is on the AP News, and it's Wyatt Grantham Phillips, August 11th, 2025. So it was the AOL that exists now is optimized for older systems. So I guess people who are still running Windows 95, perhaps, because they're in the rural area, um, all they need is access to internet, excuse me, to email. And so you don't need a lot of the graphics, I'm guessing. And so that kind of thing, it can pretty much still handle it. Well, you have 163,401 users in 2023. So 2 years ago, about 163,000 people still using AOL, that is using their phone, using a modem, to access the internet. That's 0.13% of homes. I thought that was kind of interesting, but Skype apparently ended earlier this year. Hearing a lot of these names, company names, it brings back a lot of memories, but then you realize how much things have changed so much. And when things change this quickly and this much, then you realize that it is not or it was not a government protected environment. If it was a government protected environment, then the names would persist. The systems and the methods that they were using would persist. So, in other words, if AOL was a government entity, then everyone would still be using dial-up modems, uh, right? Would be still using dial-up modems. So the decline started after the year 2000. So the height was year 2000, it just was downhill from there. And after a while, the company, after it's changed hands many, many times, didn't want people to continue to use the dial-up. But you couldn't just say stop using because they wanted to sort of shift them over into a different service. That way they didn't have to pay someone in their company to maintain this dial-up service. And the way they would do it, it was they would increase prices, right? So if you were still using dial-up, they kept increasing the price that you had to pay in order to continue using the service. So, but now they're saying, forget it, September 30th, this is the end. I thought that was surprising, but then Net Zero and Juno are still alternate options. And I use Net Zero a lot. And it was free per month. I'm pretty sure there was a free version of it. And so I used that for a while until we got DSL. And DSL, what it did was it used your existing phone line for faster internet service, right? So you can still, so with DSL, you could still use your phone and you still had internet access. So it's not practical to maintain AOL because now there's cable, there's Fios, but they had enough users for it to remain open until now. And so in the rural areas, basically it's in the rural areas, out in farm country where there's no one else around, where to lay cable or to put out lines so that people can have access to the internet in another way is just too expensive. It wasn't worth it for one family. I would imagine that a family, if they wanted it, they would have to pay for the installation. And I think that would have been extremely expensive. So satellite becomes also an alternate choice for people like that. But I would imagine since they're only using internet for email, they don't care about all of the other things like surfing on the web, shopping on the web, streaming on the web. They don't care about these things. Okay. All right. So that's supply and demand, right? So if there's demand, then you just have to find the right price for people to say yes, and I'll pay for that service. And so there's a balance that is reached after a while between the cost of the service that you're providing and the price that you're charging everybody. So with AOL, it's a kind of situation where supply is less of an issue. Rather, it's the cost of maintaining the system, which includes paying people to maintain the system as well. Um, and keep in mind that these are really old. Uh, they're old systems, right? Even the people who are the computers that they're using to access internet are very, very, very old. Um, yeah, I think most people can't imagine the computers that existed 30 years ago. So if there is demand, if demand is actually really, really great, then other companies will take up the slack because they want to take the opportunity to make money. So, and we're talking about an environment where there is no government interference. I remember when uh, TV had to go from the old school way of broadcasting to, what is it, digital broadcasting. And so all of the old TVs could not handle it. They weren't equipped to do digital. And so, a lot of people just didn't want to switch over. And I remember all of our TVs were not digital compatible. And so the one day came and then none of the TVs worked. And my parents freaked out because it's very difficult for them to learn a new system. And they kept asking me, why are they doing this to us? Uh, but that kind of situation is mandated by the government, right? It's not this, okay, let's see who wants to do it and who doesn't want to do it. And if it really was a good idea, if it really was something that a lot of people wanted, then it would happen naturally. But at the same time, those people who did not convert, they could still use the old system. But of course, that's not the timetable that the government wanted. They said, this is better for you, whether you realize it or not. So now you must do it. So this is not supply and demand dynamics, right? Normal supply and demand depends on supply, how much you have of a product, and the demand, how much people want that product. And supply and demand is really all we need to know. That's all we really need to know in order to figure out what to do, at least on one level. In other words, if there's uh, demand, then you produce it to meet the demand. And you just have to find the right price that people are willing to pay and not feel like they're getting cheated, but rather they're getting what they paid for. So price is really important. And I know a couple episodes ago, I talked about pricing with that economics professor. So prices are really, really important because it tells people what to do. And anyone who thinks that someone can overcharge, they have the freedom to overcharge, that's not true. Because let's just say someone decides that, oh, okay, like if you remember DVD players when they first came out, to buy a DVD player was $10,000. And so, wow, it was pretty expensive. And someone might argue price gouging, right? Oh, they're overcharging. No, they can charge that. But by charging so much, what it does is it incentivizes other people to produce the same product. And so now supply increases and prices come down, right? So, in other words, high prices uh, means that uh, people are going to divert more supply and effort in that direction, wherever the high prices are, to take advantage of the high prices, right? But when you do that, prices come down. So the more you try to increase the supply to take advantage and profit from the high price, the more you do that, the more the price comes down. Interestingly, low prices means that there's enough supply. And so perhaps you have to lower production. And that's a good thing because if you have already enough supply for what people are demanding, then you don't want to overproduce, right? Then you're just wasting. So you have to lower production. So the prices tell people how much to produce, where to send it. So basically that's that. Now, uh, high prices also, as I just said, incentivizes people to get into the market to make and create more supply, and this drives down prices. And so that's why people say the cure for high prices is high prices, right? And so government interference only creates monopolies and disincentivizes, right? Takes away the incentive for the prices to come down. And instead, what you're going to see are prices are always going to rise. And we see this with public transportation, the DMV, any bureaucracy controlled by the government, the prices are always going to go up. The method that they use is not really going to improve. And so therefore, service is going to slow down tremendously. And this is why there's so many lines at the DMV. This is why so many workers at the DMV are not incentivized to be polite. Customer service does not exist in monopolies, okay? Another example to show how supply and demand works is to look at gas and apartment prices after a hurricane. If there was no government interference, gas and apartment prices would explode. They would be so high, right? And this forces people to conserve because the prices are so high. But what it also does is it tells a lot of companies to divert more supply to those areas. And by doing so, the price spikes of gas and apartment units, they come down relatively quickly. When government mandates price controls, right, and they say, oh, you're not allowed to gouge gas prices, and so you can't overcharge for gas. In other words, you have to charge the same price after the hurricane as before the hurricane. So there's no change in the price. And so now the price is too low. And so people buy it all up. They buy it all up, and no one is allowed to take advantage of the profits. And so, therefore, there is no increase in supply. And so, the lack of supply persists for a very, very long time, right? So instead of prices normalizing after a couple of days, what you see is prices remaining low, but then there being no supply at all, like no gas, no vacancies for hotels and apartments, right? You won't see any supply for a very long time. I think after Hurricane Sandy, they were having problems months after the hurricane, right? Because it wasn't worth it to divert more supply to that area. In other words, people would lose money otherwise. Now, what is price gouging and what is hoarding in this context? There is no such a thing as price gouging, right? I think I did an episode a while ago um, that price gouging is just simply people who are upset that prices went up. But they have to realize that the prices are a signal. It's an indication of how much supply is there. And so if the price is going up, it means that there's not enough supply. So please send more stuff. And if you can't afford it, well, then you got to ask yourself, do I really need to do this today? Do I really need to go to work today? Do I really need to go on that vacation today? And if the answer is no, then you don't go. Hoarding also, if I'm forced to sell something at a price that I think is not worth it, I'm not going to sell it. People will turn around and say that I'm hoarding it. I'm not sharing it. I'm not selling it at a fair price. Well, what is a fair price? What I think is a fair price, I'm not allowed to charge, because if I charge that, I will be gouging and I'll be arrested for that as well. I'll be fined, penalized somehow for that. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? So gouging and hoarding are just opposite sides of the same coin. It's subjective. Depending on who you are looking at the situation, you're going to either cry gouging or hoarding, or you're going to be like, no, no, I'm acting in my own best interest. So another way of looking at this is looking at interest rates. And, since I'm a humanities professor, I would try to sort of dumb it down, not describe it in an economics kind of way, but just sort of in a, humanities kind of way. So I would just say to my class, if you want to buy some money, where do you go? The money store we call the bank. And the price of the money that you want to purchase is the interest rate, right? So the interest rate tells you how expensive the money is. The lower the interest rate, the cheaper the money. The higher the interest rate, the more expensive the money. So this also is supply and demand, supposed to be. A high interest rate means that there's not a lot of cash in the bank, right? And so they can't lend any money out. So they want to incentivize people to deposit more money. And so by having a high interest rate, they'll say, hey, if you park your money here, we'll pay you a lot more just by putting the money here, saving the money. Low interest rate means we have too much cash. People are saving too much. Borrow some more, right? And so the low interest rate is meant to incentivize people to borrow more, to go into certain projects, to build, to buy, and that's because the bank is holding on to too much cash. But because the Federal Reserve is manipulating rates and legally changing reserve requirements, right? How much the bank has to hold in reserve just in case people come for their money, because the Fed is manipulating the interest rates and changing reserve requirements. Now we don't know how much the bank has. In other words, the connection and relationship between the interest rate and supply and demand out the window. Okay. So low interest rates, and 5% is still really low interest rates. Okay. So because back in the day to borrow have a mortgage on a house, you were talking double digit mortgages, right? So to look at 5%, 7%, that's not a lot. So people with low interest, they borrow a lot more money because the money is cheap, right? Uh, People save more when money is expensive, but basically interest rates don't really rise that high. I remember my father, he cashed out a CD once, and my wife was working at that bank when he did so, and she said that the interest on his CD was something like 16% or something like that. And it was a 30-year 20-year or 30-year savings thing, right? Yeah, he would have made it in the 1970s, and he basically redeemed it in early 2000s, right? And so the interest rates were just crazy. So the higher the interest rate is, the more people are going to save. However, we live in a debt-based economy, right? And so creating credit lines or getting a credit card, this basically is creating more liquidity. In other words, it's more inflation. It's inflation because you're increasing money supply. So this further disrupts this whole idea of supply and demand. Now it creates the feeling that you have a lot more supply, and so you're going to use a lot of it more, a lot more of it. So people have to continue to borrow in order to maintain the system. And that's why the US debt can only go up. If it goes down, the system starts to crash. And that's probably why Trump reversed course in what he said he was going to do. Right now, he's just increasing the debt. And that's because the system requires it. But you have to keep in mind that the system rewards, and I'm going to get into this in the next episode, the system rewards the wealthy corrupt, okay? Because they know what's going on. The rest of the people, the plebs, that would be me and you, it takes a while for us to understand it if we bother to understand it, try to understand it. And so we're basically being used by people who are working the system to their advantage. So if inflation does not go up, if the debt does not increase, that's when everything comes due and everything starts to crash, right? So remember, currency and credit both contribute to inflation, which devalues the currency that we are using. Uh, let's see. So prosperity, however, comes with saving. So the less that we are saving, the more that we are impoverishing ourselves. We are gleefully going down the road that impoverishes us. And I think it's somehow related to capital accumulation. The more you save, the more capital you have to be able to do other things in the future. But if you're not saving at all, there's nothing left for the future. And in fact, because of the way that we are borrowing, right, the way that the country is borrowing so much money, we're actually impoverishing future generations, right? So prosperity only comes with saving. But by having low interest rates, it disincentivizes people from saving and it impoverishes them. Or to look for yield, higher interest, something that will pay them for saving, they have to go farther out on the risk curve. So they have to start investing in things that have greater risk, like real estate or cryptos, or the stock market. These have insanely high risks. But most people are not thinking that because they're desperate for a higher return on their investment or on their savings. So what we're watching right now is the end of the attempt of government to suspend the law of supply and demand, and it will crash. And there will be so much pain for a lot of people. And it's driven by the government. This whole, wealth transfer scheme is protected by the government until it's too big to protect. Now, in the private free market area, AOL, being a private company, users still have options, right? If AOL goes bankrupt, users still have options, right? So AOL might go bankrupt or AOL might shift in the way that it does business, but very few people are affected, right? 160,000 people in America are affected, but they have options. They can use Net Zero or Juno. They can go to satellite finally. They can use Starlink, whatever. There are options. But in a government controlled manipulation that we're looking at here, it's basically paying for everybody. So if you want to talk about gouging and hoarding, then it's you have to look at the government. Government is the one that is creating that propaganda, right? They are gouging us, right? Overcharging us, and they are hoarding, except they're hoarding for their own special interests for themselves or corporate insiders. And the rest of us were left in the wind. That's it for this episode. I will talk to you next time.